Despite the ongoing violence that seems to be getting worse as the polarization of various groups strengthens, on June 23rd there was an act of mercy, a glimmer of compassion, hope that good still exists in this country. On June 23rd, in a Texas county jail, a guard suffered a heart attack while he was joking with the inmates. The men broke out of their jail cell to help the guard, despite their fear that other deputies would arrive with their guns drawn on them. They shouted and banged on doors to get the attention of someone to come and help. One inmate stated, "It never crossed my mind not to help, whether he's got a gun or a badge. If he falls down, I'm gonna help him. He's a good man." The guard could have died. The inmates could have let him lie there, and he probably wouldn't have been found until another guard walked by 10 or 20 minutes later. These inmates saved the life of the guard. However, what makes me uncomfortable as I watched the footage is that the guard was white and all the inmates were white, all of them. Would this situation have played out any different if the inmates were black or Hispanic or Muslim? Would the guards who came because they heard the shouts and the banging, would they have come into that room calmly, or would the situation have played out differently? In the beginning of the book of Genesis, we are told that we are created in God's image. Every one of us is created in God's image. We are all children of God. We all have inherent worth and dignity. Those who have been killed recently are children of God just as we are, and we are killing our brothers and our sisters. I don't think there has been a better time to be reminded of Jesus' story of the Good Samaritan. Before the time of the story, Israel had split into the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom after a war with Assyria in 722 AD. The Samaritans were from the north and had mingled with the Assyrians, thus creating a population of mixed bloodlines and heritage. They also built their own place of worship on Mount Gerizim, whereas the Jews of the south wanted to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem, and they didn't interact with the Assyrians. The Samaritans became the social outcasts and the religious heretics. They were unclean and unacceptable to the Jews. So by definition, this Samaritan is the complete opposite to the expert on the law that Jesus was talking about in the lesson. This expert on the law would have known every little detail of the scriptures and the laws and would have conformed with the social expectations of the time. Though this law scholar knew all the answers to the questions Jesus asked, Jesus said, "Then go and do the same." It doesn't matter that we know what the answer is, we must go and do. Notice also that when the scholar asks, "And just who is my neighbor?" Jesus tells the story and then asks, who was the neighbor to the traveler who fell in with the robbers? The legal scholar wants to know who his neighbor is, which would imply that there are people who are not his neighbors. Jesus is saying this is the wrong question to ask. The point is, who do I make myself a neighbor to, not who is deserving of my kindness. It wasn't the priest who was the neighbor to the traveler, and it wasn't the Levite. It was the Samaritan. The Samaritan, the person from the group who the Jews detested. Jesus then charges the scholar to go and do the same, to do as the Samaritan did. The summation of the entire law is you must love the Most High God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. This law does not allow discrimination. It does not allow for picking and choosing who it is we must love or forgive or help. Love is of our hearts, and on our hearts is where God has written the new covenant. It's no longer on stone tablets or pages upon pages of legal notes. The law is in us and is carried out by us. We must love God with all our hearts and with all our minds, with all our strength. And sometimes this requires we forget about earthly rewards, possessions, or ideas in order to follow God. We must love our neighbors as ourselves, which is certainly not the easiest task, especially if we've been beaten or hurt by another and then told we must love them. I saw a post on Facebook that's been shared. It's from a young African-American woman named Natasha Howell, who stated that she was feeling hopeful and found a moment of clarity. She wrote, "So this morning I went into a convenience store to get a protein bar. As I walked through the door, I noticed that there were two white police officers, one about my age and one several years older, talking to the clerk, an older white woman, behind the counter about the shootings that have gone on in the past few days. They all looked at me and fell silent. I went about my business to get what I was looking for. As I turned back up the aisle to go pay, the oldest officer was standing at the top of the aisle watching me. As I got closer, he asked me how I was doing. I replied, 'Okay, and you?' He looked at me with a strange look and asked me, 'How are you really doing?' I looked at him and said, 'I'm tired.' His reply was, 'Me too.' Then he said, 'I guess it's not easy being either of us right now, is it?' I said, 'No, it's not.' Then he hugged me and I cried. I had never seen that man before in my life. I have no idea why he was moved to talk to me. What I do know is that he and I shared a moment this morning that was absolutely beautiful. No judgments, no justifications, just two people sharing a moment." I've heard from multiple sources and from many people that perhaps our country isn't going to be destroyed by any other nation or demonized group, but from ourselves. Our own hatred and polarization, our own inability to communicate with each other, our own fear and ignorance, our own insecurities that hinder our understanding of others is what will tear us apart. In Deuteronomy, God says, "I have set before you today life and prosperity, death and adversity." God has granted us with a choice of life and death. We have the choice to be the Good Samaritan or to be the priest or the Levite who walks by the beaten man. We have the choice to be a neighbor to our brothers and sisters, and we have a choice to love those who we encounter. As the Reverend William Barber recently stated, how much death do we have to see to scare us to life? The prophet Jeremiah proclaims the word of God. "No longer will they need to teach one another or remind one another to listen to me. All of them, high and low alike, will listen to me, says God. For I will forgive their misdeeds and will remember their sins no more." If we choose life, if we choose love, we can't go wrong. If we choose life and love, we could arrive at a point when we no longer have to fight for justice or yearn for peace. We could create it naturally ourselves. We no longer would have to remind people of God's cry for us to behave. It would come naturally from our hearts. Natasha Howell's sharing of her experience gives me hope. The inmates at the jail who saved the guard gives me hope. The moments where people who seemingly shouldn't be sharing a tender moment or saving another's life give me hope because they are so surprising. Those people, we are told, shouldn't be getting along because they're in opposing groups. In these human moments, these raw and truly human moments of mercy and compassion and grace, I see hope. And we too, like the Samaritan and like Natasha and the officer and like the inmates, must go out and be the love in the world. We know the answers and what we are expected to do. Now we must go and do.